Hi, Maria. I'm just checking that all is well.
Hey, David. Yes, thanks
Hi.
for joining.
Good, good.
Laetitia is already here. Florent is already here. And it seems to be working.
Hi, hi, Letitia. Good.
I'll just try to share my slide if you don't mind. Just tell me if
Yeah. Yes, everything is fine.
You see it, and if I put play, you should see my slide going forward.
Yes, I do.
Perfect. Well done.
The one thing is, though, I think I see it in presenter mode. So I see also your next slide, probably.
Okay. That's not a good thing, indeed. So wait. Present.
Hi, nice to see you.
Hi.
Hi, Alessandro. Yeah,
Hi.
thanks for joining. We're testing the slides.
Yeah. I'm so sorry that I'm not in Paris, but okay. What
Well, I mean, Trieste is it shouldn't be too
No,
bad.
well, I'm not complaining also because tomorrow I'm going on holidays, as I told you. So, but okay, well.
You know what I can try doing, perhaps? Mirror display. And if I put share screen, keynote, and I do play, like this, does it work better?
That's fine. Yeah, that is fine.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. And I'm going to put a second computer that's going to be filming me from the front. So if you want to pin whichever one of the two, feel free to have the view as you prefer.
Good.
Good. And okay. Okay, so stop share. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Well, I mean, thank you, David. So it all seems to work.
No
I don't know if you want to grab a coffee before we start or anything. Feel free.
No, I'm fine. Thanks. Okay. Good. So good luck.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, 15 minutes.
Hi to everybody.
Ciao Federico.
Ciao, come va? Tutto bene?
Beh, io bene, te invece? Un po' meglio?
Un po' meglio, ma ancora c'è sintomi. Ciao Leti.
Ciao, come va?
Ancora i sintomi e purtroppo sono ancora positivo, quindi sarà lunga secondo me.
Vabbè, hai perso il weekend a Parigi, mi dispiace.
Sì.
Alla fine
Sì. È il tuo aperitivo, diciamo, quello
è il mio
sulla
aperitivo, esatto. E
Ma chi te l'ha dato? Chi te l'ha passato? Lo sai? A Erice?
A Erice siamo tornati in
Erice.
tantissimi positivi,
Sì,
quindi
lo so,
va a sapere chi era. Cioè, io so almeno di 5-6 persone che sono tornate positive da Erice.
Sì, sì. E
Quindi,
Pierpaolo pure o no?
no, a lui mi sembra di no.
No?
Cioè, almeno quando
Ok.
gli ho scritto l'ultima volta ancora era negativo.
Ok.
Ok. Poi queste cose cambiano, no? C'è sempre
Sì,
la sorpresa
esatto.
il giorno dopo.
Ok.
Bene. No, ma comunque ti voglio dire, tutto a posto, albergo, volo, rimborsato tutto, quindi tranquillo.
Ottimo, ottimo.
Problema.
Infatti io ho mandato la mail alla segretaria sperando che
Ma
riuscisse
no, ma
perché...
la segretaria, guarda, è magica. Lei è una, gli mandi una mail, risolve tutta. È proprio...
Sì, poi gli ho mandato la mail in cui c'era inclusa l'assicurazione, in cui c'era scritto proprio
Sì,
che
no,
era
no, ma
prevista la
lei è proprio...
cancellazione,
Lei è
quindi
brava. Cioè, se c'è un problema lo risolve. Quindi,
ottimo, ottimo.
Boh, abbiamo testato le slide, prima funzionavano. Avrò un altro computer che mi filma, quindi vedi te quale immagini preferisci, se volete vedervi, no?
Tranquilla.
E Florent,
Senti, poi Florent è venuto? È riuscito a venire lui?
Florent è qua, aspetta.
Ok.
Vabbè, io non so
Vabbè, dai.
non riesco a
Salutamelo,
girarlo, però,
tranquilla.
però verrà a fare le domande qua praticamente, perché sennò non sentite. E
Va
niente, e
bene.
quindi ecco, speriamo
Senti,
che
ma le
sia
domande
ok.
solo sulla presentazione o sulla tesi in generale?
Guarda, le domande sono come vuoi. Mi vuoi chiedere com'è il tempo a Parigi? Puoi. Mi vuoi chiedere qualcosa di più tecnico? Puoi anche. Mi dice
Va
Sebastian
bene.
e qua c'è la telecamera. Ok, ci siamo.
Ciao Sebastiano.
Perfetto.
Ok, perfetto.
Bene, a
Ciao.
subito. Ciao ciao.
A dopo. Ciao.
Tous là. Hello, Sarah. You're muted. Bottom left.
Yes, now I'm muted. How are you?
Yes, hello. Very well. Thanks for being here.
Of course, my pleasure. Sorry that I could not be there in person. Hey, Leticia.
Sara, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás?
Leticia, are you the only person in person there?
There's also the thesis advisor. Florent is here, but otherwise, yes.
Okay. Wow.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, David. How are you? Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Okay, so let me go back to my slides. This, and I'll try. So having just hide self view, and I'll do this. Okay. I just want to check if my clicker works. Yes, it does. Ruben, close the door. Yeah, for me, it's hard to see the chat. Problems with outright exiting. Okay, so Federico has problems with the audio. So. Share, okay. I'll just. Laurent, can you tell me when Federico says he's fine? Federico's back. So I can start maybe. Mi senti adesso? Federico, can you hear me? Nope. Ouais, mais là, il ne peut pas faire de questions, non? Moi, je n'entends rien. Io non ti sento. Quoi? Quoi? Mon son de Max, ouais, vas-y.
Ouais, mais c'est parfait ça. C'est bien sur tes speakers.
Ouais, c'est bien sur mes speakers. But the other can hear me. That's what.
Yes.
We can hear you just fine.
Yeah, Federico, are
Hear
we
you
back on?
perfectly.
But I don't hear Federico either. Sometimes he seems to be talking and I don't hear him.
Yeah, okay, so we'll just give Federico maybe 2 minutes, see if he sorts out the sound. Yeah, but then he can't ask questions. That might be a bit annoying. I'll give him 5 minutes.
Yeah, he's trying to connect from a different device, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
He's having audio problems.
No. I think it's a problem with his output and input sound.
If he can hear us, maybe he can ask his questions on the chat. I mean,
I think he can't even hear us. That's a
he
bit
cannot hear us either, I see.
I think, yes. But he seems to be on the same device. That's what it's a bit puzzling. Otherwise, I send him the YouTube thing again. Apologies for the technical.
I think we have all learned to be patient in the age of COVID about this.
Yeah,
problem.
we've learned. I mean, these things, we've gotten so used to them.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, you would think that at some point they would start working, but no, after 2 years, they still don't work.
They mostly work. And if you think about it, it's so much better than anything we had before. It's really
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah.
pushed to improve because of the usage and the
Well,
situation.
I mean, we're all here today, right? I mean, having you from New York, we have David from London. I mean, it's great.
And it's the truth is, I find for many of my meetings, it's not very different from meeting in person. I mean, of course, it lacks the informal chit chat when you go grab a coffee, but for the professional part of the meeting itself, it's not very different. It's not very different. I found, for instance, our faculty meetings are much better now. They are very well attended and
And it gives you more flexibility, at least, right? You can attend things over the weekend.
It's more inclusive. People who are traveling or have scheduling problems or whatever can make a better effort to attend. So,
yeah. But sometimes there are these problems.
Sometimes there are problems. I think we lost him again. Probably he's trying to.
Yeah, but I think now he should be back in.
I see him. Maybe he's lucky this time.
Federico, can you hear us?
No.
No. I'll give you the. Yeah, I'll give you the YouTube link, and then I think that's better. Yes. It's just that. No, but I think it should be. I mean, I sent it in. I'm sorry, I have everyone is seeing my chats, but it shouldn't be anything private. We did test this before and it was working.
Yeah, we were talking to him.
Yeah, we were talking to him. I don't know how it's possible.
Talking to him, it's really like
Yeah.
it never happened in a way that the device goes wrong in such a manner exactly at the moment of the. Maybe the thing that he can try to do is to use his mobile phone, because Zoom works perfectly also on the mobile phone.
Yeah, that's true. That might be a good idea. I mean, I think he was trying to use a tablet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw him switching to a tablet.
Does anyone have some way to contact him?
I can try to see if I have his phone number somewhere.
He's disconnected right now, so maybe he was trying to reconnect. Maybe he's trying the YouTube that you suggested, Maria.
Maybe, yes. It's just I don't have my mail open, so perhaps.
I have his office, but not. Well, I write to him.
Yeah, I don't have anything but his email.
I also have only his email.
Okay, he's back. Yeah, you're muted now, so that's normal. Ouais, mais ouais, peut-être faudrait juste lui dire de join with the phone. With the phone? Yeah, the main thing is him seeing the slides. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the best idea. Or we just call him on the phone and he listens to my voice on the phone and then he looks at the video on the video here. That might be the easiest. Florent, al massimo dilli. No, adesso è mutato.
Ok.
No, oh, no, funziona.
Here it works, qua funziona. È Zoom sul mio computer che ha smesso di funzionare.
Va bene, ma al massimo guarda le slide sul tuo computer e l'audio facciamo così.
E l'audio qua, sì, tranquilla.
Perfetto, bene.
Ok, vai pure.
Vado. Ok. Ready to go.
Okay, so welcome everybody. And this is Giuliano, I'm going to be the president of the jury. So let me introduce the other members. There is Alessandro Laio from CISA, who works as a rapporteur. There is Caritza from Boston, UK, also the other rapporteur. And then Sara Solia, she's on Zoom, and Federico Giurici Tarsenghi, who they are waiting with, and Florian, he's the advisor. So Maria, you have 45 minutes to send us your results.
Okay. So thank you, Letizia, and thank you everyone for making it here today. I'm going to discuss my thesis on the topic of architecture, data structure, and algorithm, and the role these three play in modern machine learning. And in particular, as you may or may not know, machine learning is today ubiquitous in our day-to-day life. From image recognition to algorithmic trading, recommendation systems, self-driving car, medical application, and so many more. And at the basis of this success is a technology known as an artificial neural network. So an artificial neural network is a function, or simply a black box, that takes an input X and maps it to an output. In this case, it would simply take the painting and associated it the painter that painted it. Now, this function depends on some parameters, theta. And one of the reasons machine learning was so successful was the advent of a general purpose algorithm, which allows to find the correct parameters in order to perform a certain task. And the way this works is that you iteratively update the parameters on a set of images for which you know the correct output. And by this, with this training procedure on this training data, we call it, in the end, you will be able to find the correct parameters. Now, what is surprising is that these technologies, even though you are only training them on a set of images, when you present them with a new image, they're still going to give you an answer which is reasonable in many cases. And what I need to stress is that they learn this task by themselves. You're not hardcore coding some rules into the machine learns these rules by themselves, okay? Now, however, there are also some pitfalls. And in particular, even though I told you the algorithm is pretty generic, optimization is actually pretty hard. And there are many add-ons to this vanilla algorithm, which require hours of careful engineering in order to tune, okay? Also, even though these technologies generalize once in data well, they can be quite sensitive to out of distribution or adversarial example. For instance, suppose you train the machine to predict paintings of Picasso, and you only show it Picasso paintings during the cubic era. Well, then when you're going to show something of that you don't see it, excuse me, then my example is, okay, play. Do you see the green thing? Yeah. Or like this. Okay. Yes. Okay. So as I was saying, okay. Okay. Well, okay. As I was saying, it's very sensitive to out of distribution example in the sense that if you only show it images during the cubic period, when you show it something from the blue period, where the machine might be extremely confused about who the painter is. And also, very importantly for me at least, we are very unsure about the rules these networks have learned. Indeed, like if you hardcore code rules into a computer, you know exactly based on what a network makes a certain decision. However, in this case, we often have no idea of the rules that the network learned. And due to all these pitfalls, in recent years, a community of researchers have brought together their knowledge in order to open this black box of machine learning and try to understand what is really going on inside the machine. And the reason for this are varied. Well, first, it's because if we understand them better, then perhaps we can give an a priori understanding and an a priori choice of all these hyperparameters and greatly speed up the optimization process. Also, this might make them more secure and more reliable. And finally, importantly for me, perhaps it can also uncover some knowledge on the world we live in. Indeed, by maybe seeing why a neural network made a certain decision and which features in their data they have captured, perhaps they will make us understand what intrinsically makes a Picasso painting a real Picasso painting. Now, in order to understand machine learning, the slides need to work. Otherwise, you're not going to understand anything. Try to. I think what I'll try is simply to. But is it possible that it was working until now for half an hour and then now it isn't working anymore? I mean, adversarial technology. Okay, so give me a second, everybody. I think my Zoom, my keynote is. Non, mais Stéphane, je pense qu'il y a un problème ici. C'est keynote, mais comment? Okay, let me, I really apologize for this. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, my keynote is freezing. Well, a lot, but
How many tabs? Okay. And can you move on?
no, I can't. My keynote is blocked. I believe I was here 2 hours ago. No, it's blocked.
And where's your mouse? Are you focusing on it now? Wait, relax, relax.
I think I'll do this. Or worse, I send you my slides for the computer.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing is that I hope I can do that.
YouTube is running there. Or not, actually, I don't understand.
I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
The problem is I can't do anything. I can't move my computer.
Okay, wait, let's just keep pressing.
But does it turn off?
That's okay. Now try and
Okay, can you all hear me? Good, that's good.
Yes, I
I'll
can.
try this again.
Yes, yes, we hear you.
My talk, it's on Keynote Live. No, oh, Florent, I'm giving it one last try. Okay, I'll try. Thesis defense.
now like this already.
No.
So I pin this.
How do I do this?
So yeah, back and now you pin. Okay, now this is going to stay. Now you do just one.
Just one?
Like you want it, right?
Okay.
You have this on the top. You put it where you want it.
Okay.
And now you start the. Yeah.
Okay.
Just move it a bit to the side. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I think.
Picasso's back on.
Good.
Good. Yay! I'm not having a degree in computer technology. This is why I did physics and when I started. Well, okay. Last thing. Okay, so my point here was just that we need to open the black box of machine learning in order to understand how these technologies work. And in order to understand this, we need to understand the three pillars of machine learning, which are the role of the architecture, the data structure, and the algorithm used to train these machines. Just that all these three axes interact with each other, and it's really hard to disentangle the contribution of the three to the performance of the network. Hence, what I propose is to look at this in a three-dimensional space, which is spanned by these three axes. Now, one thing is that in all these three aspects, theory lags far behind practice. For the architecture side, for example, well, in practice, we have very deep neural networks with tens of layers, hundreds of millions of parameters, and also very different types of layers, from fully connected, convolutional, attention, residuals, and so many more. However, in theory, we're still barely going beyond two-layer fully connected networks, and even then, only in some very specific limits. Now, on the data side, of course, we are training this machine using real inputs. So real medical data, real self-driving car situations. Well, in theory, we're still at Gaussian and Gaussian mixture data, or some very simple generative models. And with respect to the algorithm, as I was telling you, there are many add-ons to the vanilla optimization algorithms, such as alternative optimizer, learning rate schedulers, momentum, well-chosen batch size, and all these are very hard to fix. And also there are some different algorithms which have been introduced over the years. However, in theory, most of us are still focusing on vanilla SGD, and even then, treating finite dataset size or finite batch size can sometimes be pretty challenging. So in order to expand a bit this volume of theoretical knowledge, these are the works that I performed during my PhD. Now, works 2 to 4, I'm going to discuss into more details in the later part of the talk. I'll just want to give an overview on the others. So the first work deals with the architecture. And in particular, we look at the role of overparameterization and try to reconcile the conventional bias variance trade-off of statistics with modern deep learning. Now, in work number 5, instead, we extend the results to generic convex losses and convex regularization, and we put the computations on more rigorous grounds. And lastly, the last work considers the algorithm and what's the role of learning rate schedules. So learning rate schedules basically change the learning speed as you train the network, and this can greatly impact performance. And so we analyze this in this work in some non-convex problem and try to determine an optimal schedule to train your network with. Okay, now there are 2 more works which are completely orthogonal to this three-dimensional space. The first one was done, as you can guess, during the COVID-19 pandemic and applies statistical physics tools in order to improve the performance of contact tracing application. And the last work is an extension of my master's thesis, which applies conformal bootstrap techniques in order to determine the critical exponent of some ferromagnetic materials. Now, okay, let me dive in the main topic. But before I do this, I want to give you a bit of theoretical background. And the reason I'm doing this is because all these work build on the same works and the same grounds, which are some seminal works by David and Sarah. And so this is why I'm very happy to have you here today, because I've read with a lot of attention your work. So the theoretical background describes the dynamic of 2-layer neural networks. And so the model we look at is, again, these 2-layer neural networks, which take a high-dimensional input in D dimension and have a small hidden layer, which means that the hidden layer, the network has a compressed, a low-dimensional representation of the input. And then the output is simply a number. The task we're going to train the student to do is a very common one known as the teacher-student setup. So in the teacher-student setup, you have 2 networks, a teacher network, which gives you the label, and a student network, which gives you the prediction. And so what you want is to make this is for the student to reproduce her teacher. This you do by minimizing a cost function, that measures the label prediction dissimilarity. And in particular, these analyses work in the online learning limit. So in the online learning limit, at each sample which is presented to the network, you update the weights and you never see the same sample twice. So in a sense, your training data is infinite. Now, you evaluate the network by testing the dissimilarity between the labels and the prediction over a very, very large set of images, which the networks haven't seen. And this converges to the population dissimilarity, or the expectation of the cost function over the input distribution. Now, the analysis works as follows. So your goal is to have an analytical theory which tracks the performance of the student network at all times. Now, the big problem is that you are in high dimensional, but the way to solve this is to observe that performance, as often in statistical physics, only depends on some macroscopic parameters, which are only few, as well as the second layer weights. So what these order parameters are, they're simply the overlap between the teacher-teacher weight, the overlap between the student and the teacher weight, and the overlap between the student and the student's weight. And in high dimensional, what you can show is that the dynamics of the microscopic quantities converge to a deterministic process, which is the solution of a set of ordinary differential equations. And so, since your performance only depends on these order parameters, what you find as a result is a complete set of equations which describes performance at all times. So as I told you before, this was started in seminal works by Sarah and David, and as well as Bill and Schwarze. Rigorous proof of this procedure exists in various contexts, and these are just some citations. And by working hard enough, and this was one of the first things we did, you can actually extend the theory to inputs which have non-trivial input-input covariance. Now, what I propose to you is to put this to work and see what kind of the results we can actually get from this analysis. So the first thing I'm going to describe is work number 3, done in collaboration with Sebastian, Florent, and Lenka. And so the question this work addresses is whether feature learning is really essential. So this might be a really silly question to you, because I told you that neural networks work because they can extract good features from their data, right? So of course, feature learning is essential. But the reason we asked this question was a result that came out in 2018 that actually shows that very deep or very wide neural networks only do kernel method or random feature regression. And intuitively, this can be understood in a sense of, if your network has many parameters, okay? If each one of these parameters changes just slightly, it will produce a large change in the overall output of the network, which means that the weights do not need to move much from their initialization in order to fit the data. And in particular, what Jaco and Au could show is that in the limit of infinite width, this is actually precise, and the network converges to a kernel method, which is well approximated by random features. And so these, by definition, random features and kernel method cannot do feature learning. So does this mean that deep neural networks are just glorified kernel methods? And does it mean that actually feature learning is really not essential at all? Well, what we propose is to study this in a toy model. And the toy model is that of Gaussian mixture classification, which is a very easy task. On this task, we're going to compare small and shallow neural networks, as the one I showed you before, to lazy methods such as random feature or kernel methods. And in particular, we chose a toy model, which is the XOR-like mixture, which looks exactly like this. And why? Well, one of the reasons is that it's non-separable in input space. And the other is that it gives you a very clear measure of signal levels in the problem, which is given by the distance of the clusters to the origin at fixed clusters width. Now, most of you must be thinking that this problem is super easy because, I mean, you just draw the two diagonals and that's it, you've classified. But the problem is that this problem is actually high dimensional. And I'm not telling the network which one are the two relevant directions, which means that the network, what he's seeing is actually something more like this, where you can see that the problem is non-trivial. And we started making some observation. So of course you have the random guessing error at 0.5. And we plot the classification error as a function of the signal level. So for this data set, what's pretty neat is that you can compute an oracle-like performance, which is given by a classifier that has knowledge of the underlying probability distribution. And then if we run the simulations for a 2-layer neural network, what we see is that it achieves oracle-like performance for all signal levels. And in particular, it's able to learn the correct mixture. In sharp contrast, instead, random features and lazy methods only learn at very high signal to noise levels. And we wanted to understand this, right? I mean, why aren't they able to learn as well as 2-layer neural networks? Now, let us start by seeing what happens in 2-layer neural networks. What we can see is that the network first learns the subspace and the error decreases exponentially, and then aligns its weight to the mean, which means that it's really learning the mixture. And what we want to do is to understand this from a theoretical perspective. So we want to study the dynamics. So the way to go about this is exactly the same theoretical analysis we did before, except that in this case, instead of having the output, the label, which is conditional on the input for a teacher network, we reverse the generative process and we have an input which is conditional on the label. The order parameters change a tiny little bit, but the end result and the rationality is the same. At the end, you get a complete set of equations which track your performance at all times. Now, the thing is that, okay, we have this complete set of equations, but we do want to get some results out of these equations. We do not only want to integrate them in order to see what happens. And we've seen that the network learns the XOR, and we want to study long times because we want to study asymptotic performances. So what we're going to do is that we're going to use the symmetries of the underlying distribution in order to make some assumptions on the form of the order parameters. And this will allow us to obtain a reduced set of equations which scales linearly with the number of nodes instead of scaling quadratically. So this is much, much faster when you want to integrate it. In particular, for only 4 nodes, you have 4 equations instead of having 32, okay? So it's really a big gain. And what I want to show you is that indeed it works. When you run the equations and you run the simulation, they match. Now, let me move on to the random feature networks and to lazy methods. So first, what is a random feature network? Well, they can be thought of as a 1 hidden layer network, which has first layer weights which are fixed and very large hidden dimension. However, this can also be seen as a transformation. So you take the input space, it's transformed in a higher dimensional feature space with a nonlinear transformation, and then linear regression is applied in feature space. And in order to study the performance of random features and why they fail at low signal, we chose the second dissection way of thinking. So what we know is that the performance of linear regression only depends on the first 2 moments of the features. Hence, we can simply study the first 2 moments of the features and see why random features fail. And indeed, what we were able to find is that if the signal is too low, the transformation in feature space performed by kernel method is simply a linear transformation, which means that if the distribution is non-separable in input space, it remains non-separable in feature space. Hence, linear regression cannot work. At high signal instead, the opposite things happen. So that the nonlinear effects in the transformation kick in, the mixture becomes separable, and linear regression works well. Now, because we're physicists, this is a visualization of how the transformation changes. So you can see that at low signal, it's non-separable. And then as I increase the signal levels and decrease my noise levels, well, little by little, nonlinear effects kick in, which allow me to obtain a separable mixture in feature space. Now, because we're physicists, we wanted to go a bit further and see how performance scales with the relevant quantities in the system. So what we found is that the performance depends on the input dimension square root divided by the 4th order root of the width divided by the signal level. But now someone that's listening carefully might tell you, well, then it's not true that they don't learn at a low signal. You just need to take a wider network, right? I mean, just take the width scaling with the square input dimension. Well, it turns out actually that it's not that easy, because in a recent result, May Montanari showed that the performance is not a function of the width, but of the minimum between the width and the number of samples. But then you might answer me that this is not a problem again. Just take a higher number of samples, that scales with the input dimension squared. Well, first I want to point out that this is a very, very, very large number of samples, because I'm already taking the thermodynamic limit of infinite dimensional inputs. And also, unfortunately, this result is not accessible by your theory, which needs to have the number of samples scaling linearly with input dimension. So just to recap, what we've seen is that two-layer neural networks, which do feature learning by definition, are able to achieve Oracle-like performance for OS and R, while lazy method and random feature require high signal level in order to learn the task. So this allows us to determine that feature learning is indeed essential in some tasks. But now we need to go further, right? I mean, yes, feature learning is essential, but which features are learned by the network and how? And we propose to analyze this in unsupervised learning, which offers an ideal scenario to study feature learning. In particular, we'll look at shallow autoencoders, which are the simplest type of architecture for unsupervised learning. And the way an autoencoder works is that they take a high dimensional input, then obtain a compressed representation of this input at the bottleneck in the middle, and then reprojects it out in high dimensional space in order to obtain a reconstructed image of the input. And the aim is to make the reconstructed image as similar as possible as the input. I want to stress that the bottleneck in the middle is crucial if we want the network to capture only a few of the relevant features and not to capture a too extensive representation. Now, the question again is, how do these autoencoders learn the good features, and which features do they actually capture? So the theoretical analysis is exactly the same as before, except that before we again had the label, conditional for a teacher network on the input, and we had the scalar output. Here instead, we don't have a teacher anymore because we're just trying to reconstruct the input. So we'll compare the output to the input directly. And we need to be a bit careful with the scaling because the output this time is high dimensional. The order parameters change a bit again, but again, we obtain a complete set of equations describing the performance at all time. Oh, I think we're having the same problem as before. No, it works. It's the clicker maybe. Okay. So now to study this, we need to define which data we're going to work on. And our equation and our theoretical analysis assumes to have Gaussian data. However, we cannot use simply IID data because there are no features to capture in IID data. Hence, we're going to propose a synthetic data set in which the inputs are still Gaussian and obtained via a low-rank multiplication of a small Gaussian vector in lower dimensional with added noise. And to make it easy on the eye, we're going to choose the covariance matrix such that the leading eigenvectors look like sinusoidals, as you see here. However, I'll also show the results on some more realistic benchmark data set often used in the theory of neural networks. So this here, I'm showing you the covariance matrix of the inputs. And as you can see, it takes this form. So it has a bulk of small eigenvalues and only a few spikes. And the spikes represent the important features in the data set. And what we find from our equations is that you have a separation between the equations for the bulk modes and the equations for the spike modes. In particular, the equation for this bulk mode predict that these are suppressed exponentially, while the equations for the spike mode predict that the learning speed depends on how important the feature is, so that more important features are learned faster than less important features. Now, okay, as comparing theory to simulation, we can indeed see that our equations do work. And also we can verify that the modes are indeed learned sequentially. That is, the important modes are learned faster than the less important modes. And this we can see through this plateau in the performance. Lastly, I want to point out that even though my network is nonlinear, it only achieves the PCA reconstruction error. And this is unsurprising because it's a known result from the 80s that actually even nonlinear autoencoders, if they have a shallow decoder, those still achieve only PCA. But now, one of the questions we were asking us is which features are captured. And the way to do so is to open the autoencoder and see what is the representation it learned at the bottleneck. And doing this led to this picture here. So what I'm plotting here in blue is the weight vector of the decoder. And in black, you can see the leading eigenvector, which I showed in my first slide. So as you can see in the beginning, the weights are random, so they don't look like anything. While at the end, what we can recognize is that the network learned the correct subspace of the important feature, but instead of learning the correct eigenvectors, it learned the superposition of them, right? And this is not really what we want. I mean, we would like to obtain a one-to-one correspondence between the representations at the bottleneck and the eigenvectors. And so in order to do so, and on benchmark data sets, this can also be seen by looking at only a partial reconstruction. So instead of using the whole hidden layer to reconstruct, we only use part of the autoencoder. And as you can see, even though the full reconstruction of the pants is not too bad, if I look at the partial reconstruction, I have a mix of pants and sweatshirt, really meaning that I'm learning an overlap between the two. So now how are we going to learn the correct features and how dynamically are these features learned? Now, the second question on the dynamics, I'm not going to discuss here, but those that are interested can go and see it in the thesis or in the paper that discusses this. However, let us look at how can I force the network to learn the correct features. So one thing to note is that the stochastic gradient descent algorithm is rotation invariant. So the network has no way of knowing whether it recovered the correct feature or a rotation of the relevant ones. And in the equations we derive, this shows up by the fact that even a superposition as we obtain is a solution to the ODEs and is a fixed point. So the way to go about it is to introduce a modified algorithm which breaks this rotational symmetry, which means that the overlap, this superposition is not going to be a solution anymore. And by training a network with this modified algorithm, we can indeed verify that it recovered the correct eigenvector and not the superposition that we had before. Now we can also check this on the benchmark dataset as we were doing before. And here you can really see that even though the vanilla SGD just gave me a mix of pants and sweatshirt, well, if I look at the new algorithm, it gives me exactly just pants. So this really shows how data and algorithm interplay together. If you change the algorithm, it's going to change which features of the data I'm actually going to capture. Now, some of you may have been surprised by the fact that I said that our theory applies to Gaussian data, and yet I'm also comparing it to the results on real data sets. And these two are very different if you think about it. Indeed, synthetic data sets have infinite training sample, while here while real data sets have a finite data set. Also, they're infinite dimensional because we're taking the thermodynamic limit, while real data sets are finite dimensional. And lastly, and more crucially, inputs in the synthetic model are Gaussian. Well, in the real data set, they're far from Gaussian, right? I mean, the fact that you can recognize a horse in this image shows that they're far from Gaussian. However, when we test our equations on simulations on real data, we can see that actually theory and simulations do agree. And so does this mean that for neural networks and maybe for two-layer neural networks, let's brave, Gaussian data is actually equivalent to non-Gaussian data and they can't recognize anymore? So this question was the subject of much investigation recently, and it is known as the Gaussian equivalence theorem or principle, which was proven in a certain situation by a work with Sébastien Florent and collaborators, and which basically states that for some two-layer neural networks, under some conditions, you can replace the real inputs by their Gaussian equivalents, and you still obtain the same performance. And so for me, one of the key questions to understand is, when are more features captured? When does the network learn that there's something beyond the Gaussian work, that there are these higher order moments? And this is something I'm interested in working in. There are some preliminary results by Sebastian and another of his collaborators in Trieste. And I hope to continue working on this in future. Now that we've seen how algorithm and data can interplay together, what I want to argue is that we can also analyze different training algorithms. And in particular, I'll ask the question of whether we can simplify the vanilla BP in order and still obtain good performance. So let me back up a bit. I told you that the neural network is a function that depends on some parameters. However, one of the big problems is how to choose these parameters, right? The way the optimization used today work is that they take the cost landscape and they update the parameters, always going in the direction of steepest descent. However, one of the problems is, if you need to go in the direction of steepest descent, you need to compute the gradient of the cost function. And this can be very complicated. And it's known as the credit assignment problem. So one of the reasons machine learning is so successful is the fact that BP was introduced. And what BP does is that it takes the error signal at the output and then computes the derivative sequentially from bottom layer up to top layer. What this means is that it's propagating the information contained in the error vector from the end of the network to the beginning. One of the problems with this is the fact that you have to compute the gradients sequentially. So you cannot update all your layers simultaneously. So especially as modern neural networks are getting so deep, this can cause some serious speed limitations. So can we speed up this backward pass? In order to answer this question, in 2016, Nokland and al. Proposed direct feedback alignment. What direct feedback alignment does is that it takes the error and injects it into every single layer through a random projection matrix. But then, does this even work? Because as I was telling you, BP was introduced in order to compute the gradients, which ensure that you're going in the direction of steepest descent in the landscape. But now here, we aren't really computing the gradient of any cost function. So how can I be sure that I'm actually going in the right direction in the landscape, right? It was surprising that a recent work came that showed that, well, actually DFA scales up to modern architectures as well. And it allows to train deep networks on a series of tasks, including tasks involving transformers, on language translations, etc. So this was really a thorough investigation of when direct feedback alignment works. I'm doing a lot of advertisement for feedback alignment because it does have some marvels. These include, well, the speed up in deep networks that I was discussing. Also, it is more biologically plausible of BP, as it is very unlikely that in our brain, it's the same synapses propagating the information backward, forward and backward. And it also avoids some other problems such as vanishing gradients, and it has applications to robustness and privacy. However, even if the advertisement is quite good, there are also some pitfalls. Otherwise, we would all be training with DFA. And some of these pitfalls include that it often leads to less good results than BP. Also, there's kind of a lack of theoretical understanding of why and when DFA works, and it notoriously fails to train convolutional neural networks, which are most commonly used in vision tasks. So the aim of this work is really to understand how and when DFA work and see whether we can improve it. In order to understand this, we are going to start by the same theoretical analysis as before. So I'm not going to give you the details again because I think you've understood. But the basic idea is that here the network is faced with two competing objectives. On the one hand, it needs to learn the task, so it has to match her teacher. On the other hand, it has to align the gradients, because if it aligns the gradients of DFA with that of BP, then you're sure that you're going in the right direction in the landscape. And in this simple setup, aligning the gradients simply means that your second layer weights are proportional to the feedback vector. And running a simulation, what we notice is that what happens is that the student first aligns to the feedback vector and then converges to the solution which is closest to the aligned, which is most aligned with the feedback vector. So in a sense, in the initial phase of training, it's making sure that it's going in the right direction by aligning with the feedback vector, and then it's memorizing the task by converging to the solution which is closest to the region it has fallen into. And we could show this theoretically. And in particular, we could theoretically show that learning occurs in two phases. Again, a first alignment phase in which the student aligns its gradient with the BP gradient, the weights are aligned, is followed by a memorization phase where the student gives up some alignment in order to fit the data. But now we need to go to deeper networks, because in the end, that's really what we care about. And in deeper network, gradient alignment leads to a weight alignment, which is a bit more intricate than the one of shallow networks. But the idea is the same. It's always that the weights are constrained to be proportional to a certain configuration of random feedback matrices. But then this might come a bit as a shock to someone that's looking at this carefully, because if my weights are aligned with random matrices, I'm losing completely all my expressivity, because the aim of neural networks is to have the weights which are flexible in order to be able to learn the task. So what is the good compromise for this? And what we're able to show is that different layers play different roles. The top layers of the network focus on alignment, and so are proportional to this configuration, while the bottom layer focus on expressivity and on fitting their data. Now this leads to something we've called degeneracy breaking. So in BP, there are many equivalent solutions. And by equivalent solution, I mean solutions in the landscape which have the same performance. And BP can converge to either one of these solutions, just depending on initial condition, training data, etc. But there are equivalents. While in DFA, because of this first phase in which the weights have to align to the matrices, well, you're constrained to always fall in the same solution. So you break this degeneracy among solutions. And you can measure this in experiments by starting many networks from different initial conditions and training them with the same feedback matrices on the same training data set. And what you can see is that BP falls into many different solutions, so that if you measure the similarity between the weights, they stay of order 10-2. In contrast, in DFA, the weights correlate during training. And at the end of training, the weights always fall into the same solution. So we can also understand the two reasons or the two key components which allow DFA to work. On the one hand, you need for the aligned region to be accessible by the optimization path. So your weights need to be able to align with this configuration of feedback matrix. And the second condition is that once I'm aligned, I need to fall in a region of the landscape that does contain some good solutions. Because if there are no good solutions nearby, the network is not going to be able to attain the task. And this also leads us to understand why DFA fails for convolutional networks. And in particular, this is because convolutional layers are much more constrained than fully connected layers. And they're constrained by locality and weight sharing. And so there are two directions which we could investigate in order to make maybe DFA work for convolutional network. On the one hand, it's finding a way to relax this constraint, and attention and self-attention allow you to do so, especially for the flexibility you have at the beginning of training. Otherwise, you could also maybe accommodate this constraint by a careful choice of feedback matrices. And this is subject, again, to ongoing work. And I know Alessandro and his PhD student are still working on this. So I hope results will come out pretty soon. So let me just recap what we've understood is that in DFA, the network first aligns the gradients and then fits the data. And that the feedback matrices completely constrain which solutions are those found by DFA. And for me, this leads to another question. As I've shown you, DFA, the update done by DFA, is much simpler than the one of BP, in a sense that the update carries much less information about, doesn't carry the information about the backward wait. So how much can we actually simplify BP and still get away with it and still attain good performance? Well, as we've seen, this depends on the architecture, as it doesn't work at all for convolutional layers, but we also show that it also depends on the data, as some noise in the labels can hinder performance with DFA. So I just want to finish here on some future directions, which I think are the next steps that I would do would I continue researching. And on the algorithm side, I think it would be interesting to keep investigating this question of how much we can simplify BP, understand for which data set and for which architecture. And also this might perhaps lead to some more biologically plausible algorithm. On the data side, well, of course, we need to go beyond Gaussian data. So this, for me, you need to understand when neural networks and under which condition they exploit the non-Gaussianity in the data. And this, I propose to do it in a controlled theoretical setup where we can really control the different, the magnitude of the different components in the system. And lastly, regarding architecture, and I think this is really crucial, well, I've only discussed one hidden layer network, but I really think that theory should aim at going deep, deeper, and deeper. And this is because machine learning is based on deep neural network, and it's often called deep learning. And it's clear in practice that the deeper you make the network, almost always, the better your performance. So we need to understand what is important about depth and in which ways depth allows you to achieve better performance. And on this note, I would like to thank you for your attention and to thank all the wonderful people I had the chance to discuss with and collaborate with during these 3 years. And also Giulio, who is actually on a sailing competition today. And so who sent me this picture and says hi.
Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, I want to come here. You have the Zoom here, right?
Yes, not the sound.
The sound is here.
The sound is here. Maybe
Okay.
you can stay here, I think.
No, but just 1 second. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just to invite one of the rapporteurs. So maybe Alessandro, allow you to start with the questions.
All right.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I'll also stop sharing. Perhaps like this, we will see you big. Look.
Yeah, which is not necessarily a good thing, but okay. You will have to withstand my face for all right. So, well, it was really a pleasure to read your thesis. I have learned a lot. I will read it again because I don't think I've learned everything that can be learned from that. So it's a really very nice piece of work. I have to congratulate for the clarity. I have actually many, well, I have many questions. Maybe I will start from one on direct feedback alignment. So here, the motivations for direct feedback alignment, which you were discussing during your presentation, is actually related to computational efficiency, right? So basically, you can do simultaneous update on all the layers at the same time, which is for sure totally correct, no? But on the other hand, another motivation, in particular for feedback alignment, but also for direct feedback alignment, somehow is biological plausibility. Can you comment a little bit on that? Because biological plausibility, in some sense, I would expect that the error, yes, does propagate from the output towards the input through a different axons then the manner in which the input is processed. But why? So does it make sense not to learn the weights of the, let's say, backward axons? So that's my question. So basically, in direct feedback alignment and in feedback alignment, you are sort of keeping the weights of the reverse axons, let's call it in this manner, fixed. But so this seems to me, okay, a very reasonable choice on the computational point of view, but biologically speaking, is this necessary? Well, but more in general, can you comment a little bit on did you think about the relationship between this manner of learning a model and how real, well, let's say real brain learns?
Yes, so of course, I'm not at all an expert on the biological plausibility. I think you are right in saying that especially feedback alignment was introduced just to go above the thing that in biological networks, it's very unlikely that you have the same forward and backward weights. And I think this was the main motivation. But I know that there are some other problems also with feedback alignment, and it's still subject to research. For instance, there is a recent paper as well, which argues that perhaps even just having a backward pass might not be biologically plausible, and that perhaps we should be able to train the network only doing a sequence of forward passes. And well, they introduce an algorithm called Pepita in particular, and which is able to train some networks only doing forward passes, which might as well be perhaps more biologically plausible. But to be entirely honest, I didn't investigate very thoroughly what are the different views on how biological networks might learn, and how to make neural networks more biologically plausible.
Thanks very much. Maybe, I don't know, how do you want to proceed, but maybe we can loop through the examiners, because otherwise I don't, if you like better, I can ask first all my questions.
No, usually you can ask us, a certain number of questions, not go into infinity, but like 3 or 4 questions yourself, and then we go through the other examiners.
All right. So maybe I ask, well, I go in order of things that I find personally interesting, which is a very relative concept, of course. So the other things is autoencoders. So here in autoencoders, so you find these results that basically in the regime that you are studying, the autoencoder is only learning to get rid of the non-linearity, no? So basically this, it can do it in different manners according to how the thing is done. Like if it's a ReLU, it makes it by introducing an offset. If it is a hyperbolic tangent, it simply multiplies the features by a scaling factor, no?
Yes.
So this thing, while it is clear why this thing should happen if you have a single, well, if your autoencoder is not deep, well, if you have just, let's say, a bottleneck somehow, with no hidden layers in between the input and the bottleneck, I don't see why this thing should really happen in a real world autoencoder. Do you agree?
So I agree to a certain extent. The thing is that if you only have a 1-layer decoder, you can have as complicated encoder as you want. You're still going to achieve PCA.
I agree.
In some
so
ways,
this
you
is
need
clear.
to recover. This is clear. No, I mean, if you had a deeper decoder, we know that autoencoders do something beyond PCA. Otherwise, we wouldn't be using them, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense. But the thing is that we didn't really, we tried investigating that. And the reason we didn't is that deep autoencoders are actually horrible beasts to train. I mean, and there's a very vast amount of literature just on how to achieve something better than PCA with deep autoencoders. So the answer is, this doesn't happen. Of course, you can do better than PCA, but it's very hard. It's very hard in the sense that you need to know how to do it. And so what we chose was more really to focus on to understand the dynamics also of the nonlinearity, because I mean, linear networks are nice, but nonlinear networks have different dynamics, and we wanted to understand this. But in a sense, yes, it's true that you are limited by the PCA error. So in the end, you're still recovering the linear regime.
Well, one thing that maybe would be still, let's say, within the so these I'm not really able to judge, but maybe would be within the technical capabilities of your theoretical method, would be just making it not symmetric, and maybe simply adding another layer between the bottleneck and the output.
But the problem is that if you make that layer small, then you're still going to do PCA.
Yeah.
PCA at the rank of the second small network. And if you make that network of the same size as the output, or of the same order as the output, then you essentially have a rectangular network, which is the limit I would very much like to be able to analyze. And I think it would be a great paper being able to analyze this.
Yeah.
But already, I mean, also in the supervised case is something that at least I've never seen done, analyzing this rectangular limit of neural networks.
So basically, this actually is, well, an achievable theoretical result. It's not blue sky hope, but it's so this is the direction where you're also trying to go. So you agree that trying to actually...
I agree. I agree, but I think that we should perhaps first look at a very simple supervised learning case. So something at some point we wanted to do was simply to look at a rectangular network in a very simple teacher-student with IID input, so that you remove all the supplementary complication, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And this is already not.
I agree that before moving to an autoencoder, so then an autoencoder will be a special, well, let's say an extra result. But I agree that working in a supervised.
Once you have solved that, I think the autoencoder will be a very natural extension. Let's put it that way.
All right. I don't know. Can I make I make another question or?
Yeah, she's saying yes.
Yeah, I don't know, because I don't want to really. So the problem in this kind of thing is that typically you end up doing all the questions. Well, okay. So maybe I do a third one. So this is somehow also related to possible directions for further theoretical development, which to my perception, which is the perception of a practitioner and an outsider, seem pretty close, but maybe they are not. So the thing is the following, that in many frameworks, real world data frameworks, you basically find out that if you try to transfer a network from a classification task to another classification task, you find out that so basically the representations that are actually learned in the very first part of the network are basically unchanged, or changed only let's say perturbatively, no? While instead, what actually, so of course, if you are changing, maybe let's say that you change the label of your images in a reasonable manner, or or even transfer this to a completely different recognition task, of course, you must learn, let's say, new features in the last layer, even just in the layers of the classifier, no? So this thing where you basically change by, let's say, a random small perturbation, the weights in the first layers, while you do real feature learning only in the last layer, actually looks very, very much like your random feature network, no? So because basically, so the big difference is that so basically, so to go directly to the question, did you think to basically, so did you try, or does it make sense to transfer, so to extend your theoretical framework where you have a first part of the network in, let's say, in the lazy regime, and the second part of the network in the feature learning regime? So
the thing is that, although I agree that if you do like transfer learning, reusing the top layers, sometimes it works. It's pretty, but the thing is that the top layers are still learning to extract some kind of, how to say, abstract representation of your data set, right? And then you might say, okay, if I train it on a different task, but on the same data set, this abstract representation should still be the same. But
well,
I need to develop that. If I just assign these layers randomly,
no.
I mean, you do have a random representation. So in a sense, I'm not sure you'll have something sensible at the end of the random features.
No, well, the thing is that you can say that what is random, well, let's say, the thing is that if you try to transfer the first layers to another task, it's not that you can take random features. You must take the same, but you can take features which are perturbatively similar to the ones of the previous task. No, so it's like having let's say, like a neural tangent kernel, but instead of having as a reference the case in which the weights are 0, you have as a reference the case in which the weights are the one that you have learned on the previous task. No, so I was actually wondering if you can exploit this thing to do some analytics. So basically, you have a reference.
I mean, maybe you could, if I understand well, what you're proposing is to assume that the bottom layer, that the top layers are moving on the different time scale than like the bottom layer. So in a sense, you have kind of an adiabatic.
You have an adiabatic thing, but even more, because basically you can assume that the early layers are really changing perturbatively, so you can actually model it, for example, in some perturbative method, Gaussian for sure. And
in a sense, that's a bit what was done in the hidden manifold model of Sebastian, right? In a sense, that hidden manifold model, you can view it as the way they were viewing it was you take a Gaussian C in low dimensional, you map it to a higher dimensional vector for a random transformation, and then you apply a 2-layer neural network on that, which does feature learning. And however, you could also say that this is simply a 2-layer, so 2 hidden layer neural network in which the first layer weights are fixed, right? And that is kind of your transformation of your lower dimensional input into the higher dimensional feature space, and then doing feature learning on the.
This is exactly the point. So the point is that, so I have seen many theoretical attempts that actually go very, very close to what I think it would be very useful. And I was actually one, which is actually doing this thing on a real world network in this condition, no? Because so the thing that actually changes in that case is that this is a really deep neural network. So I don't know, it's just
I mean, I agree that it's deep, but at the same time, if you aren't learning the first layer, in the end, you're just doing feature learning on a different space.
I agree.
So something I think that we've never done and that I think is interesting and is worthwhile to be done is to say, look at like, what are the key things in the covariance of the input or in the higher order moments which basically ask you, if I take Gaussian inputs, I apply a transformation, or if I take some inputs, I apply a transformation, and I get my features, and what in these features is going to impact my dynamics. But in a sense, that's a bit asking, it's a bit like asking the question of which features in my inputs are actually impacting my dynamics and how are they impacting it. So am I learning faster? Am I learning slower? How am I learning? Am I learning at the same time, etc.?
Okay, fine. So here, if we would have a blackboard, it would be a very interesting subject for a blackboard discussion, but I think now maybe I would leave the floor to another examiner, and because I then had other questions, but maybe it's better if we move
Next
on.
time I come to Trieste, I promise.
Okay, thank you very much, Alessandra. So maybe it's time for David to ask his questions as a second rapporteur.
Hi. So firstly, Maria, I'm really sorry for the technical problems that you've experienced. It has added unnecessary pressure to a situation that is anyway quite difficult. Secondly, I wanted to congratulate you for writing such an excellent thesis that is both substantial and deep, and also for the really good presentation.
Thanks, really appreciate it.
So I will start actually with a difficult question. And the question is, so you correctly described the three-dimensional space in which we look at architectures, data, and algorithms.
Yes.
And you correctly also said that we are currently mostly focusing on the two-layer machines.
Yes.
So my question is, of all your new insight and algorithms and understanding, what actually carries over to the deep learning machines? Because neural networks were the business of the 90s. Deep learning machines since 2006 features very highly. So what new idea, insight do we gain from that?
Well, I would say that I'm going to give an example, which is the first work I discussed less on overparameterization. I think that there we were already able to kind of quantify at least a bit or grasp the fact that the interpolation threshold, which is something we do observe in deep learning, stems really from a variance term. And so for fluctuations really in the optimization and in the initialization. So I think that that is already something. I think, for instance, also this thing of the Gaussian equivalence for two layers, I find that very interesting. As deep learning, they kind of, it has been shown that the deep machines learn learn functions and distributions of increasing complexity. So often they'll first learn a linear classifier, which only learns the first two moments, and then learn higher order, more complex functions. And so I think that perhaps it can at least help us understand this first phase of learning. And then I must say that surprisingly, I mean, in the case of the double descent, for instance, we tested this also. Okay, it's not very deep, it's 4 layers, but still on 4 layers fully connected, and we could see the same thing. In the case of DFA as well, it's really thanks to the toy model that we're able to uncover the saline and memorize mechanism, and which we then tested in deep nonlinear networks. And we saw that it actually, I mean, the intuition carries over. So I agree that perhaps we cannot really have a quantitative understanding of these things, but perhaps it can help us a bit in gaining some intuitions. And this is why I also think that indeed we need to go deep. I mean, I really think that unless we at least analyze a rectangular network or something like that, we are not going to be able to say things which will apply to very deep networks.
Okay, thank you. So following more or less in the same direction, so algorithms. So one of the main problems is that, of course, when we are looking at deep learning machines, you have the permutation reflection symmetry at each layer. That means you can permute all of the nodes, all of the weights, or you can multiply all of them. So this adds n factorial 2 to the power of n if we are talking about binary solutions at each layer. That means that we have horrible symmetries.
Yeah.
So how do you think your algorithm is going to address the problem when we have many, many different layers, because you have loads of solutions to choose from in terms of locking onto a specific solution, aligning the gradients, and then.
Okay, so in deep networks, this is perhaps something I was a bit sloppy about, and I agree. What I mean is, okay, perhaps there won't be one solution to which I will converge. I mean, the FA in this case won't constrain you to one solution, but it will for sure decrease the subset of solutions you converge to. So I think it would be more precise to say, I mean, you have many equivalent solutions, and among these, the FA is going to converge only to a smaller set of these. So you have a bit less freedom, but I agree that it will not be a unique solution.
Yeah, of course, it's not going to be unique. I'm saying that the space is really complicated, because the search space of possible weights is really complicated, because it has replicas and replicas and replicas of the same kind of weights. So you may lose your way very quickly in such a complicated space.
Yes.
Yeah. So I assume that this is something that should be still checked, how well it works in real networks.
Well, in a sense, I think that the answer, I'm not sure it answers, but I think it's really this first part where you align, because if you are in the special aligned configuration, your gradient of the FA is equal to the one of BP. Then I agree that it is still not extremely well understood how BP actually finds a good solution. So that I think it's something that's, but okay, if we knew how BP really finds a good solution, we can say, okay, in the FA, this first phase ensures that the two gradients are aligned, so that I'm going in the same direction, and then I'm simply memorizing with something which is quite close. But okay, I agree that if you're asking on a BP point of view, how optimization really works and why do I converge to good solutions, I think there are some possible answers, but that I know of, there's no clear theoretical understanding of how it works.
Just a comment, BP, the idea behind BP was in order to reduce computational complexity by moving the gradients from one layer to the next.
Yeah.
Another question that I have is about autoencoders.
Okay.
So autoencoders is in a way lossy compression.
Yeah.
Because why do we need to do lossy compression using autoencoders? Because this is an information theoretical problem that has been addressed using information theoretical tools. Why do we need to address them this way?
Well, I think that it's because our point of view was slightly different. So our aim was not to look at a lossy compression. Our aim was to look at feature learning. And so we wanted to look at something that was learning features. And we were more interested, then the fact that we were looking at the same type of synthetic data sets was just because we needed a data set to analyze and we needed a generative model. And this is why we choose this. But I do agree that if you would like to solve it, an autoencoder is an overkill, because you could simply do PCA and we know that you would find a good solution.
Yes, but it has its limitations. So the fact that PCA is a solution is exactly indicative of the fact that it is like a lossy compression kind of problem.
Yes, yeah, I agree that it's limited. And if I need to be entirely honest with you, when we started researching this, we were trying to get something which was better than PCA. And I think we spent a month on this until we found the result that actually PCA is the optimal thing you can do. So as much as I think that understanding the dynamics is still something interesting. And this is also why people look at the dynamics of linear models, because they can still tell you something. But I do agree that it is limited, and that if we really wanted to look at feature learning in more details, we should be able to, as Alessandro was saying, add a layer in the decoder.
Good. I'm not going to ask you more questions because I don't want to hijack the defense, but I just wanted to make one comment, and that is that we are all the time talking about deep learning machines and about multi-layer neural networks, but in reality, if one looks at the record-breaking record-breaking machines, they are very, very carefully structured, that in a way that incorporates a lot of engineering understanding. They are not just layers lined up one after the other.
I agree. And I think that was my first point in the pitfalls. What I wanted to highlight was really this, is that actually being able to optimize. I've tried a few times. I still struggle to train a 4-layer multi-connected on Cypher 10 and make it fit the data. And I know Stefan, who is in the room, is very good at doing that and has many tips and tricks how to initialize your weights, etc., to do that. And I agree that in practice, I mean, if you want to train a transformer, you need to structure it very carefully, and it's really not easy to train.
Yeah. A sub-comment to that is the fact that interpretability and explainability are the two things that deep learning machines are relatively poor at. And this is something that we have to do in order to explain, to convince people to use them, especially when we are talking about critical applications like health, finance, safety, and so on.
Yeah,
but
I agree.
I'll leave all of that apart and aside, and we'll just congratulate you again for writing such an excellent thesis and for the presentation. I'll pass you on to the next reviewer.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. So, Sarah, you want to go on?
Sure. Maria, I want to start by echoing a little bit the comments that David made. It was difficult to add these technical problems to the natural stress of defending your PhD thesis, but I think you handled everything with great poise and aplomb, and you were totally in control of the situation. So congratulations on handling these technical problems so well. And I also want to extend my congratulations both for the writing of a very substantial and very clearly presented thesis, and on a very clear presentation today. So congratulations. It was a pleasure to be part of this. So let me ask you a few questions. So at some point you went into an argument that stressed the problem as the dimensionality of the input becomes very large.
Yes.
However, even when we talk about, I was thinking of ImageNet, that if you think 256 by 256 by 3, you get these images living a 200,000 dimensional space. However, images do not live in a 200,000 dimensional space. They live in a subdimensional manifold, and recent work using a variety of methods have found that this manifold estimated between 25 and 40, let's say 40 dimensions. So do we really, as you point out, we need to look at the actual structure of inputs and not assume inputs that are Gaussianly distributed with as many dimensions as the dimensions of the space. So how do you think that these arguments about scaling relationships that take into account the dimensionality of the input should be modified to account actually for the dimensionality of the low dimensional manifold in which the inputs actually live?
So tough question. If I knew, I think I would have many more citations on Google Scholar, unfortunately. I think that, well, one way that physicists, at least we can go about this, is surely through generative models. And I am thinking again of the hidden manifold that Sebastian Florent worked on, that proposed this very interesting concept that your label only depends on some lower dimensional features, but your student instead is seeing an input in higher dimensional. And I think this reflects the very intuitive notion that we have that, yes, an input and a classification task in the end only depends on some relevant features. But I think that also you can't really separate this from the concept of task, because I'm not really sure that you can say that images are, you can say images are in low dimensional, but for sure, the relevant dimensions for your task depend on the task itself. So you can easily build a task in which some of the dimensions become irrelevant or some other dimensions become relevant. So it's not yet extremely clear to me, when people look at, I mean, I know you can, there are many measures of intrinsic dimensionality of the data in itself, but still, I think that we need to consider how the task impacts what the network is actually, because surely the network captures different features depending on the task it wants to learn.
You're right, and it's very likely that the dimensionality of the inputs in the context of the task will be even smaller than the dimensionality of the manifold in which the inputs lie. So all the inputs lie in this low dimensional manifold, but now the task will tell you how are you going to cluster them or separate them. Exactly. And which features are you going to extract in order to do that? And that number might be even smaller. I agree with you that the task context is independent, is relevant. However, I think it's important that we take into account the low dimensionality of the manifold in which inputs live in the real world, so that our problems are not as hard as we think they are if we look at the strict dimensionality of the space in which the inputs live, but the manifold.
Of course, and I think that it would be very interesting, for instance, in this hidden manifold model, if we could perhaps have a, I don't know, some kind of interpolation between the manifold dimension being 1 and the manifold dimension going until the input dimension, and checking how this manifold dimension actually impacts your learning. I mean, but I think that the best we can do for now, or the best I can do for now, would be really proposing a generative model which reflects this intuition and studying how the relevant parameters kind of affect the final performance.
That's a very interesting idea, to have a generative model where you have a knob that allows you to control the dimensionality of the manifold and go from low to a bit higher. That's a very nice idea. Let me go back to the PCA problem that David also addressed. You pointed out correctly that in your networks, as in the original PCA linear networks of the late 80s, the system, if you allow for k hidden units, if you're autoencoder, the system finds a solution of vectors that span the same k-dimensional subspace as the k leading principal components. However, you cannot do a one-to-one identification between the weights found by the hidden units and the principal components themselves. And you said that you found a way of solving that problem by breaking the rotational symmetry that is intrinsic, that once you are in the correct subspace, any basis, and it doesn't even have to be an orthogonal, just any k linearly independent vectors provide a good basis for that. So give me a little bit of your intuition of how breaking the symmetry allows you to find the PCs, because breaking the symmetry might allow you to find another orthonormal basis, which is not ordered by variance, the way the principal components are. So how does introducing a breaking of the rotational symmetry allow you the correct principal components?
Well, more than intuition, let me start by saying that, so first, this was more than an original idea, greatly inspired by some works that were already done in other linear decomposition methods, such as Sanger's rule. And there is a way to modify it in such a way to find the correct the correct eigenvectors, and that in the equation you can actually show that your only fixed points are those eigenvectors, and that if you don't have the eigenvectors, there you have a rotation matrix which doesn't cancel out, and so in the end you have something which is not a fixed point. It's true that I almost want to say, what else could you converge to? And it's not entirely clear to me, if you're not converging to the eigenvectors, where would your network go? But
be a rotated version, and as you point out technically correctly, then it doesn't, there is a cancellation that doesn't happen.
There is a cancellation that doesn't happen. I mean, if it's really a rotation of the basis, and also there is something, is that when you really look at this modified algorithm, you can see that it actually gives more weight to the first component. Like the first node takes more weight from the first component, the second from the second component. So in a sense, you really have like almost an attraction by these components to the different weights, This is artificially put in by the modified algorithm.
Right. But so you're creating the hierarchy that
exactly. You're creating a
principal component analysis gives you under the original network, the vanilla net autoencoder formulations cannot find. So that's good. So let me go back to the question of deep versus shallow networks that you and David were discussing earlier. Do you have any, so when we started working on neural networks, in the late 80s, there were these proofs that a single hidden layer suffices. It just needs to be extremely wide. And it's very simple to do in the binary case. It's a little bit more involved in the graded case, in the continuous neurons case. But there were proofs that came out that saying that neural networks with a single hidden layer, if you allow for an arbitrary width, will be universal approximators of continuous functions.
Yeah.
So in that context, why do you think we gain so much from the practical point of view by going deep and narrow as opposed to shallow and very wide? Do you have an intuition of why the deep networks work so much better? I know that this is not, I know that you have focused on cases where you could do analytic work and your methods are very powerful, and therefore your own research has been limited to what I would call shallow and wide as necessary networks. But do you have any, you've been thinking about these problems for many years, and you've been thinking about the need to understand deep neural networks. So I was curious to know what your intuition was about why going deep facilitates or improves performance, and seems to facilitate learning also, unless you run into vanishing gradient.
This would be a very hand-waving intuition.
That's
but
what
my understanding, at least, is that the number of the width at the hidden layer, if you use the shallow network, scales very, very quickly with the dimensions of the inputs, and which means that as soon as your inputs are even, I mean, MNIST is 784, Cypher is 1,000, you would still need a pretty wide neural network in order to be able to fit this data. And the thing is that when you go deep, what you're able to do is to make different layers focus on different things. So to get from the input, develop a more and more abstract representation of the inputs, and then be able from this representation to classify it. And this allows you to constrain the width, but you need to go deeper. Whereas if you had just one hidden layer, then you would need to go very, very wide. And so to my understanding, that's a bit the problem.
I think it goes back to the problem that you were addressing when you discussed the kernel methods and how easy it is to linearize. Because if you have a two-layer network, essentially the hidden layer has to provide a linearly separable representation so that then the output layer can do its job, because the output layer is just a perceptor acting on the inputs provided by the hidden layer. So, so in some sense, is one layer enough, powerful enough, or it is, we know it's powerful enough, but how easy it is to find the representation.
That's also a thing, is that we know that there exists a certain set of weights that allow to express the function, but it's true that from a dynamical point of view, I'm not really sure we actually know how long it would take for the network to find this correct representation.
From the point of view of the dynamics of learning.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll thank you very much. And again, congratulations on a beautifully written thesis and on a very clear presentation. And
thank you.
Maybe I should pass the torch to Federico.
Yes, that's right. Federico.
Hope it works. Can you listen to me?
Yes, it works.
Okay.
Oh,
it works.
It worked.
So, first of all, I want to apologize to have been one of the technical problems that make the presentation more stressful than necessary. So I'm very sorry for that. Anyway, the presentation was very, very nice. So I have to congratulate with you. And it was very stimulating. So even if I'm the less expert among the all in the commission. So my question would be much simpler. I have to say that your presentation was very insightful. So let me start from the end. So DFA, I was not aware of this method. And when you say that the DFA in some sense is building solutions which are more similar, does it mean that at the end of the learning process, you are going to find the solution which are typically different from those that you find by backpropagation? And can we say that these solutions belong to that part of the space of weights, which is, say, more entropically favored? So connecting to what Riccardo Zecchina and co-workers did in some sense.
So I'll start by saying that I'm actually not very familiar with Riccardo Zecchina's work, even though I met Luca that worked there for many years. So more than intrinsically different. So let's say that a solution found by DFA is also a solution of BP, but not all solution found by BP can be found by DFA. Okay, so it's kind of, you have a subset of solution of BP, and DFA is will converge to only a subset of these. So it's include.
This subset of solution has some specific features. So for example, the local entropy is larger because the idea of fitting more solution in the same part of the weight space. So
I'm not sure you have more solutions. We didn't study the entropy at all, but what is for sure that we could determine, and especially in the two-layer case, was that it was consistently the solution that was most aligned with or closest to the aligned configuration. So that you would only deviate slightly. I mean, if you had let's say that if you had the aligned configuration, you could see it as a hyperplane, for instance, and then the space of solutions was here, you would always fall in the one which was closest to the aligned configuration, and you wouldn't fall to one which was very far away. So in a sense, you would never disalign a lot.
And do this solution provide a similar generalization error, a worse one, or?
In the case of the two-layer networks, they are equivalent solutions. So you really find same general, like the statics are exactly the same as in BP. So classification error is identical, your order parameters are the same, etc. In the case of deep networks, I would say it depends. I mean, in some cases, you have an asymptotic performance, which is the same for DFA as BP. In some cases, DFA does a bit worse, but it's also true, and this is a point that was always stressed by Julien Delaunay that did this big paper, is that in BP, we've been working toward like optimizing the hyperparameters and tuning them for 20 years or for 10 years. In DFA, there's like a few groups that are doing it, and they've been doing it for 5 years. So at the same time, we don't really know whether the solution is worse or whether we don't know how to attain the good solutions. And that, I mean, it's until we don't find a way or an answer, it's a purely philosophical question.
Okay. And can you explain me a little bit better what you mean by gradient alignment, in the sense that at any given point in the weight space, I understand that you compute the gradient and you try to follow that. But since during the learning, you are changing position in the space, you are changing the gradient. When you say that you align with the gradient, you mean that you align and you keep aligned for all the successive times, or you have to realign every time you change the position in the weight space?
If you had perfect alignment, what I mean is every time you would make a step, the step you would compute with BP and the step you would compute with DFA
is the same,
in exactly the same direction.
So once you align, you keep aligned because you are using the same gradient.
We compute is exactly like this. So at every time we do a step, we compute the gradient of BP, we compute the gradient of DFA, and we check their overlap.
Okay. I have another simple, silly question about the Gaussian equivalence, because usually when I listen to this, I understand that a single Gaussian is a simple process enough. But when you may say that there is Gaussian equivalence, can it be that is equivalent to the sum of many Gaussians with a given covariance matrix? And so, because by summing many Gaussian variables, I can achieve something very much complicated. So even the solution of the SK model can be represented as the sum of Gaussian variables in a hierarchical tree. No. So what do you mean by Gaussian equivalence?
Gaussian equivalence? I'll give you an example. Is, for instance, you have cipher. You take all your inputs. Okay, you take all your inputs. You compute their covariance matrix, and then and their mean, and you generate inputs which are Gaussian with that covariance matrix and that mean. And then if you train on a teacher-student task with those inputs, or if you train, for instance, to classify the autoencoder on those Gaussian images, you're going to have exactly the same performance as if you were training on the true cipher 10. And
okay.
That's
and
what
the performance is computed, so the quality of the performance is computed always with the data set.
Always.
So you train with Gaussian and then you check for the generalization error with the data set.
Exactly, with the real data set. But I agree that, for instance, something we're looking at is in the supervised learning case, for instance, for classification, in the Gaussian mixture case, something we did look at, and we don't have an answer yet. I think we hope to get an answer soon, is also what is the good Gaussian equivalent model, right? Because if I have cipher 10, I have 10 classes, right? And how do is it a Gaussian mixture? Then what is the right covariance? What are the right means? But this also depends on the class. I mean, if you're doing binary classification on cipher 10, it's possible that your Gaussian equivalent model is not going to be the same as if you were doing the full 10 class classification. So in a sense, I think that is indeed an interesting question.
Because not learning all Gaussian mixture is easy. So even if there is Gaussian equivalence, then if you're equivalent with a Gaussian mixture, it can be a hard problem, as hard as the original problem, right?
Yeah, but I think the thing is that it's really surprising that even though these data sets are non-Gaussian, when you compute, you check your theory and your simulations, they get you similar results. And I think that's the surprising thing. We're not making a statement about the hardness of the task in a certain way.
Okay, thanks for it. And I have a couple of questions on the encoder. When you encode and then you reproduce you want to compare the input and the output, and they live in very high dimensional space. To me, it's non-trivial how to compare something in high dimensional spaces, because it's not enough to say they are identical. What does it mean, identical? So it's in high dimensional space, you can translate, you can rotate. So what is a good measure for comparing high dimensional images in this case, because you are essentially comparing images?
So a good measure, I'm not sure. The measure we use is really we take the mean squared error. So it's 1 over d, with d the dimension, the input minus the reconstruction squared, and that's our measure.
Okay, so if an image is perfectly reconstructed but translated, for you that is a quite large error, because if I translate the image and so a translated pant doesn't match the original pant, and so you would say there is a quite large error. So you don't use the symmetries of the problem.
No.
So you don't compute the minimum over all possible symmetries of the distance, because I will translate and put at least the center of mass of the two objects on top of each other before computing the distance, because
in a sense,
an encoder producing a translated pant is fine, no?
It depends. I mean, I would say it really depends on what you consider a reconstructed image. Do you consider that you're because if I want to have a pen on the center of the table and the table near the window, I could tell you that if I translate the position of the table or the position of the pen, I mean, you might tell me it's the same thing. If even in the image reflected, you might tell me it's the same image, but reflected. But I could argue that no, what I want is really the original image without this reflection. So what we do.
But the idea is that you are learning classes. So I don't think that your autoencoder is going to produce exactly the original image. It's going to produce an element of that class. And even a translated pent is still a pent.
Okay, I agree with that. It's true that now that you say it, it's possible something that perhaps we should have taken care of. But in the analysis, if I'll be entirely honest, we don't. So in the analysis, we really say we want to have exactly the same image, or I mean, the rotation cancels out. So that's fine. But except for that, we really wanted to say you need to obtain exactly the same image and not just an image in the same class. I think
I know we're not supposed to be having a conversation between us, but Federico, an autoencoder is not learning classes. An autoencoder is implementing unsupervised learning and is trying to find a low-dimensional representation from which you can reconstruct the inputs. Doesn't know anything about classes, the autoencoder.
Okay.
So
but once you cluster
the cluster is you do afterwards. The autoencoder doesn't know that you want to cluster. The autoencoder is trying to denoise the data and find a low dimensional representation of the inputs, and you train it with the quadratic error that Maria explained. So that quadratic error doesn't allow for the invariances. It's just a pixel minus pixel squared. It doesn't allow for the invariances that you have in mind.
So in general, the invariances is not used in the definition of the distance.
It's no, because the autoencoder is just trying to find a low-dimensional, hopefully the noise representation of the inputs. Is unsupervised learning. Sorry for.
Okay.
No, I mean,
thanks. No. Okay. And so you don't use either the fact that there is a two-dimensional structure, or that you use it when you in some sense the nodes which are close in the two-dimensional structure, they.
No, we don't use it. So a priori, our autoencoder has no idea about the structure in the inputs. So our autoencoder is just presented inputs one after the other. And that's exactly what we want to analyze, is how it learns this intrinsic structure. So we are not inputting any exterior knowledge in a way.
Okay. And in the trained, so once you train the machine, and so once you learn the representation, do you realize in some way that, for example, these are 2D images? So can you understand from observing the trained network that indeed you pass to the network 2D images and not 3D tomographic data?
You do by looking at the representation at the hidden layer. And this is by, I mean, it was a bit my point about the equations. And then in the equation, you really see that you're going to have the order parameters that correspond to all the different modes that are in the bulk, so that are irrelevant, that are going to be suppressed. And you're just going to stay with the two relevant ones in the case where you have a two-dimensional subspace. So in a sense, once it's trained, that you can really like see that the network learned these principal components.
Okay. But just last question about the initial part, the learning dynamics of the two-layer neural networks. I was curious to understand whether the result that you get holds for different losses and different algorithms, or you concentrate on some specific losses. So when you write the dynamical field theory for the equation for the parameters of the, you define the overlap between teacher and teacher, teacher and student, and student student. And then you solve the evolution in time of that. My question is, how general is your result in terms of loss function? And
some results are pretty generic. For instance, for the autoencoder, we tested also like if we're using more complicated things, so not putting any hand put like scalings, not putting, how to say, we also using adaptive optimizer, and we checked that the phenomenology more or less holds. Now, the theoretical analysis is really for the mean squared error. And this is simply because we have sums that appear in the equations that have k terms. K is the number of hidden nodes, instead of having k squared. So you could, if you wanted, extend the analysis to something like non-mean squared error and logistic loss, etc. But then what would happen is that you would have integrals and expectations over k squared, order k squared variable, instead of just like 3 or 4. And so we've never done that. I think it is feasible. You wouldn't have an analytical formula for these integrals. But for instance, in the Gaussian mixture, we were evaluating them with Monte Carlo techniques, the integrals, and it was working pretty well. So in a sense, you could run it. I'm not sure how much insight you would actually get from the equations. And that's always the thing. I mean, writing an equation is normally half the work. Once you have the equation, actually getting some insights from these equations is many times maybe even harder than writing them.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. In the nice plot that you show us when you compare the oracle and the two-layer neural network with the random feature, and random feature performance essentially requires a factor 10 larger signal-to-noise ratio than the oracle. Do you understand why this factor 10? So in some sense, where it comes from? So why you need so usually one says that we understand that we solve theoretically a problem where we can really compute thresholds. Okay, so you say this is the threshold for the oracle. Instead, the random feature requires 10 more signal here, the distance from the center of the Gaussians. Where this factor 10 come from?
I'm gonna take it out again. So
yeah,
as you
exactly,
see, the threshold is actually, in this case, is a factor 10, just because we have a specific value of this input dimension, of this ratio between the input dimension and the minimum between the width and the width to the power 1/4, right? I mean, if I look at here, you see, and so the factor 10 actually depends on what ratio you choose. So our point is just that you do need to have the width, which scales as squared the input dimension, if you want to have the same oracle-like performance. So if you want to learn also at low signal. And however, I mean, if you don't do that, but instead of having the squared, you have 3/2, then it's not going to be a factor 10. It's going to be here in the middle.
Okay. Okay.
So it really depends
scaling,
on how the width scales with the input dimension. I mean, if you have P, which is 4D, it's going to be different than if you have P equals 2D, etc.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Thank you very much, and still congratulations for the presentation. Very nice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think.
Okay. Thank you all for the questions. So I'm going to ask Florent now to give us his impression about Thesis and say a couple of words.
One, two. Yes, probably turn. Turn off your volume. Yeah, but turn off your volume as well. Good. 1, 2. Okay, I have a short list of questions that No, I'm joking. This is not the time for questions from me. And it's not yet time for congratulations. So what can I possibly do? First of all, I must say that I never doubt you. Even today, when you started to have problems, I knew you are the strongest person ever, and you would go through. And indeed, you didn't even flinch. So congrats. It was not a very easy time to do a PhD, and that's not only for you, for many people. You probably remember our first Lesuge together. I remember a very nice evening. There was Lucas Alietti playing piano, and we all have good time, and we are celebrating your work with Stefan and the Double Descent. And it was February 2020, and the future seemed only bright. And we made a lot of plans about all the fantastic collaboration we were going to do and all the visits we were going to plan. And then the reality hit us. And yet here we are. And that was the first paper. You have 7 of them now. That's not too bad. I think what was really important for us was the second Lesouche, which is just, just to tell you how the school was really important. We are lucky enough to have the former director of the school. The second Lesouche was really, really also an amazing time for us, the post-COVID time. And now when I look at all these works, I mean, many of them started from the second school. I mean, the DFA work and your interaction with Sebastian. So, it's really impressive what you could achieve always during those time. I'm almost sorry that you could not really enjoy the full PhD experience, but we did the best we can, and let's see if it's good enough. In the meantime, I must say it was really a pleasure to work with you, and you have shown a lot of independence. It's really impressive. I think we have 4 papers together, only 3 of them are related to the subject of the thesis, and started already to do collaboration with many people who are already in the room today. And that's also a sign of maturity, which again, I never doubt you. So, okay, I thank you for the occasion you gave me to work with me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, so I'm just getting Florent's computer, so I'm not going to ask you many questions. There have been many questions from the jury already. So just one little thing before ending. So about this FDA algorithm compared to the BP one.
Yes.
So what happens if you, a little bit related to what Federico was asking, so what happens if you started from somewhere near a BP solution, which is not normally found by the FDA? Where does it go to?
I should almost ask the question to Stefan, who I think tested this extremely thoroughly on what happens. And actually, many times what happens is that you aren't really able to learn as well. Because the problem is that the network gets really confused about what it's supposed to do. Because on the one hand, it wants to,
go somewhere else.
Yes. But on the other hand, it really wants to decrease the load. So that's a really good question, and something actually we thought of looking at with Alessandro as well, was looking whether we could do some perturbative analysis around the solution of BP where the weights are not aligned, and see whether that could allow you to then explore different parts of the landscape. So saying, okay, I arrive at a solution to BP, but now I would really like to explore the whole of the good landscape. So could I use DFA to kind of escape this? I mean, that's an idea. I don't know if Alessandro has worked a bit more on this, but.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the answer. So thank you for all the answers that you gave. And I think it's time now to let us deliberate.
Good.
Yes.
So everyone else, please.
Yes, we are going to use mine, but if you leave it open because it might keep the station.
Yeah. Because I'm in the meeting, so I wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
Maybe you might want to turn off the live streaming on YouTube.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
Yeah, that's true.
So